After leaving the belief system of the message, it's always awkward when encountering people who have also left that same belief system. Many former members that I've encountered are hesitant to speak about it, some of them expressing what they call real pain when even thinking about the memories. Others are very excited to hear our experiences and to share theirs. Those willing to share their experiences often laugh at some of the things we used to believe, after realizing just how strange all of it seems now. One couple that I encountered was in the Branham Tabernacle during the meeting that William Branham claimed God wrote on the wall, a moment referred to in the message as the handwriting on the wall. They remember being surprised when later hearing about this claim, when it was such a normal meeting. According to them, everyone showed up early to get a seat, sat through a long sermon, walked outside, and then discussed where they were going to eat. They didn't remember hearing anybody talking about anything unusual that happened during the service, which one would certainly expect should God himself write on the wall in his own handwriting. I can remember them joking, saying, "I guess going out to eat was more important than the handwriting." That same couple informed me that when the book, Raven, The Untold Story of Reverend Jim Jones and His People, was published, it caused quite a stir in Jeffersonville. After learning that William Branham and his close associates helped launch Jim Jones's career in the Cadle Tabernacle, I also wanted to know more. At the time, I knew very little about Jim Jones, and wasn't even aware that Jones was a minister in the message. I remember how shocked I was when I read Jones' own handwriting pleading with one of his People's Temple members to stay in the message. It was time to learn more about People's Temple, and the best place to start was the Laurel Street Tabernacle, where Jim Jones first heard about the message. When ground broke for the new Laurel Street Tabernacle on the corner of Laurel and Prospect Streets on April 10, 1949, the people of Indianapolis could have never known the impact that this little building would have upon the world. Just a little over 4,000 square feet and seating 200, the new Assemblies of God Church would soon be filled to overflowing, as it took center stage for the full gospel and Pentecostal holiness revivals during the early 1950s. Assemblies of God District Secretary T.F. Zimmerman traveled from the denomination's headquarters in Springfield, Missouri, to preach the morning services, while District Superintendent Roy E. Wead offered the dedicatory address in the church led by Reverend John L. Price. Jack Beam, who would later become a pillar for Jim Jones and People's Temple, was on the board. The Reverend Lester Sumerall, Assemblies of God missionary and evangelist from South Bend, Indiana, came to hold a series of nightly meetings in celebration. The church began in 1913 as just a small Sunday school class led by the Reverend D.B. Rickard. Within just 2 years, the class grew into a church body, and the original tabernacle was built across the street from the dedication. The church had continued to grow under the leadership of Rickard until 1922, when the torch was passed from the Reverend John L. Price. Price was an Indianapolis native and a World War II military veteran who served at the Assembly of God churches in the Hampton and Newport News, Virginia areas during his time stationed at Fort Monroe. He was also very active in the Assemblies of God denomination, speaking at annual conventions at Reverend Zimmerman's church in South Bend, Indiana, the Glad Tidings Tabernacle in Munster, Indiana, and other area revivals. Under his leadership, the church would continue to flourish and become a recognized name in the revival circuits, and Price would become a familiar face among the Assemblies of God leaders. Within just 3 years of the dedication ceremony, Price would represent Laurel Street Church at the 2-week celebration of the grand opening of Richmond's new Assemblies of God Evangelistic Center at the First Assembly of God Church on National Road. With regards to the creation of People's Temple, the year of the Laurel Street Tabernacle's groundbreaking could not have been more symbolic. 1949 was a year of division and conflict within the Assemblies of God denomination, and leaders of the assemblies would be forced to make difficult decisions. 1950, when the church was dedicated, was the first year that those decisions were being enforced. The post-World War II healing revival was quickly spreading, and with it, a series of new, extra-biblical doctrines that would play a critical role in the splitting of churches and creation of new leaders. Though in their infancy, this set of doctrines was being accepted and promoted by numerous ministers and evangelists under the title Latter Rain, which referred to an ancient prophecy in the book of Joel in the Christian Bible. Leaders of the movement taught that the Christian church must restore and equip a fivefold ministry, which included modern-day apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Then, while appointing key individuals to these roles, the movement presented the idea that mainstream Christianity had become apostate and needed purging. Participants were asked to decide for themselves which side of the spiritual war they would take, and those who sided with the fivefold ministries would purge the wickedness and judge the apostate. Leaders of the Assemblies of God watched horrified, while men and women they considered to be unqualified took leadership roles throughout the organization. They realized that this new theology was divisive. Due to the teaching that denominational circles had grown corrupt, those who joined the movement were forced to consider those who remained in denominational churches as apostates. Assemblies of God leaders met in Seattle, Washington, in September 1949 to determine how best to handle the situation, and after deliberation concluded that the new order of Latter Rain was founded upon Christian extremism with the sole purpose of destroying fellowship among like-minded Christian believers. The Reverend John L. Price of the Laurel Street Tabernacle in Indianapolis was no stranger to the Latter Rain revival. Former faith healer and revivalist F. Bosworth, who had joined Branham's campaign, frequented Indianapolis and the surrounding cities, and was a familiar face at the Cadle Tabernacle where Branham and Jim Jones would hold their first joint nationwide healing revivals. Bosworth, who was instrumental in the creation of the Assemblies of God and who claimed to be an authority on divine healing, had written a book entitled Christ the Healer. Price often preached on the same subject, with sermons having the same title. Jim Jones, who was a Methodist pastor in Somerset, Indiana at the time, was no stranger to the revival. He had taken interest in the evangelist promoted by William Branham's Voice of Healing publication and was already making connections in the Latter Rain movement. He was called out as a prophet during a church revival in Columbus, Indiana, just north of Branham's church in Jeffersonville, and took his place among those in the fivefold ministry. Later, he traveled with his wife Marceline to a Latter Rain revival at the Bethesda Temple in Detroit, Michigan, where he was so eager to speak that the Reverend Myrtle Beall invited him to the platform. Beall, whose Assemblies of God church had chosen to side with the Latter Rain half of the division, was forced to withdraw from the Assemblies of God. In 1951, Jones was offered a large sum of money to hold a series of revivals in Los Angeles, California, for the Reverend Orvil Lee Jaggars. Jaggars was both an editor for Branham's publication and affiliated with LeRoy Kopp of Calvary Temple. Like Branham, Jaggars taught unusual doctrines concerning the zodiac's relationship to Christianity and teachings on unidentified flying objects. Also like Branham, Jaggars' extra-biblical doctrines resulted in the formation of a destructive cult. It should come as no surprise that the subject of UFOs would be repeated by Jones in the Jonestown Commune. Just outside of Richmond, Indiana, in 1953, William Branham and Ern Baxter held a series of revivals in Connersville, Indiana, at the Roberts Park Amphitheater. 2 services were held daily from May 31st through June 10th, one at 10 p.m. and another at 7:30 p.m. The ministers invited the public under the guise of plain old-fashioned revival. Branham and Baxter had recently held a similar series of revivals in New York, where Branham taught the latter-rain message and British Israelism. Not long after the Connorsville revival, Jones changed the name of his Somerset Methodist Church to Christian Assembly and began advertising full gospel preaching in the Sunday newspapers. Within months, Jones became a familiar face in the local Indianapolis Pentecostal community and was invited to preach for the first time at the Laurel Street Tabernacle. The Reverend Price had announced that he would soon be retiring, and Jones was a potential candidate to replace him. Armed with the intriguing latter-rain doctrine, members of the church overlooked Jones' participation in the New Order of the Latter Rain and ignored the warnings included in the resolution from the Assemblies of God Council. Based simply upon the number of times that Jones shared the pulpit at the Laurel Street Tabernacle during his participation with Latter Rain, one could assume that Price and his congregation were considering a split from the main branch of the Assemblies of God. The church fully adopted Jones as an associate pastor and began advertising Reverend James Jones beside Reverend J. L. Price in their Sunday advertisements. It also changed the name to New Laurel Street Tabernacle and began advertising thousands of miracles, as was typical among ministers participating in the healing revival. They also introduced the slogan, Deliverance Center for All People. Price and Jones began holding miracle services, advertising 1,000 miracles in 2 months, making waves throughout the Assemblies of God community, especially among those who were aware of Jones' affiliation with Latter Rain. Price began claiming that his sermons were the prophetic word under anointed teaching, signifying his acceptance of the position of prophet in the fivefold ministry. Not long after, sweeping changes came to the Laurel Street Tabernacle. It was announced that the Reverend W. L. Thornton would be replacing John L. Price as head pastor of the Laurel Street Tabernacle, and that he would soon be leading an expansion and reorganization program. He had served for 2 years as the director of youth for the main branch of the Assemblies of God, after serving for 3 years as an evangelist in the Indiana area. Thornton was strongly affiliated with the non-Latter Rain sect of the Assemblies of God, attending international conventions at the headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. Whether as a result of Thornton's impending takeover of the church and its direction, or as the primary cause of it, Jones had created his own business entity and registered it in the state of Indiana as Wings of Deliverance Incorporated on April 4, 1955. Jones himself had no theological degree and would have been ineligible for leading an Assemblies of God church for multiple reasons. That did not diminish his impact on the church, however, and his being replaced caused divisions in the Laurel Street Tabernacle. Several members sided with Jones during the church split and met briefly under the Wings of Deliverance name. Either symbolically, claiming that his motivation was geared towards helping the people of the church, or pure coincidence, the group started meeting under the name People's Temple. Eventually, it transitioned to the title People's Temple Full Gospel. Within weeks, Jones' Latter Rain and Voice of Healing community came to his aid. In January 1956, William Branham agreed to preach at People's Temple. In February, Latter Rain evangelist and close business associate of William Branham, the Reverend Joseph Mattsson-Boze of the Philadelphia Church in Chicago, offered Jones an honorary certificate of ordination into the Independent Assemblies of God, the Latter Rain side of the division in the Assemblies, and joined Jones in a series of revival meetings. In a handwritten note found on the back of the certificate of ordination, Jones accepted his membership into the Independent Assemblies of God, as he expressed a very clear amount of distaste for his recent experience at the Laurel Street Tabernacle. He wrote, "Note, this ordination was given voluntarily by Joseph Mattsson-Boze, executive and official of Independent Assemblies. No creed or autocratic jurisdiction as to the teachings of church organization, Only requirement is that ministers practice the love of Christ and live honorable and practice every aspect of integrity in his pastoral and other relationships. This was given as an honorary recognition without my request for our good work as an independent church in Indianapolis, Indiana. I naturally accept their ordination in that it requires no endorsement of a limited creed, dogmatic ritual, or narrow religious restrictive fellowship. The People's Temple was officially born, and Jones had officially taken his place in the latter rain revival. Nationally, he was gaining recognition. Locally, however, Jones was dealing with the fallout from his recent church split. Once again, his latter rain and Voice of Healing community came to his aid. Jones began advertising that the People's Temple would be host to William Branham in a Brotherhood Healing Crusade at the Cadle Tabernacle from June 11th to the 15th, 1956. Ministers and delegates from several states would be attending the revival, with up to 1,000 ministers expected. Among them was a who's who lineup of ministers involved both with the latter rain and the Voice of Healing revivals. The featured ministers included Joseph Mattsson-Boze, latter rain evangelist and publisher of the Herald of Faith, Reverend A.W. Rasmussen, leader of the latter rain and head of the Independent Assemblies of God, Dr. David Duplessis, head of the World Pentecostal Fellowship, and William Branham, who many considered to be the leader of the Faith Healing Revival and a close associate to each of the other speakers. People's Temple would host the convention once more in 1957, announcing Branham as the featured minister in both the afternoon and evening services held again at the Cadle Tabernacle, and with Voice of Healing editors and revivalists in the morning at People's Temple. The Reverend Tommy L. Osborne, editor for Voice of Healing, and evangelist Tommy Hicks and F.F. Bosworth were the featured ministers. Jones not only worked as a healing evangelist in Branham's message following, he also pastored the People's Temple Church with the same doctrine and title. When one Earl Jackson, a People's Temple parishioner, attempted to escape, Jones pleaded with him to return to the message. Jones wrote, "Personal Brother Jackson, my beloved brother in Christ, concern for you kept me up praying the entire night. I am going to speak sincerely and frankly. God sent you to People's Temple, and you must not release yourself. I know there are things about the message that you may not see, but it is God. As long as we love Christ, we have unity and understanding to compensate for all of the little things that you and I might disagree on. Earl, you will be making a serious mistake if you leave our temple that God has ordained and declared you to be part of. Don't go out to see the proof of what I just said. Hear me as a voice crying to you from the depths of love and fondness for you. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Don't go back on the light. I know you wouldn't intentionally, but if you leave the place that Christ has set you in, much sorrow and heartache will be the result. God impressed my mind strongly in every prayer in the early hours before dawn that you would be making a terrible mistake to leave. Please hear my counsel, which I give you with a full heart and love for you." Learning that William Branham joined Jim Jones in People's Temple at the launch of Jones's career as a faith healer and latter-rain evangelist in 1956 was sobering. We had been taught that William Branham had the gift of discernment, and that he could peer into the very soul of the people he worked with on the platform and in private interviews. Learning that William Branham held private interviews with People's Temple's members and did not warn them of the tragedy that would come raised many questions for me. Learning that William Branham and Joseph Mattsson-Boze continued to work with Jones in Indianapolis through 1957 also raised more questions. It was surprising to learn that Joseph Mattsson-Boze and Jim Jones closely worked with each other at a time when Joseph Mattsson-Boze worked closely with William Branham. But when I learned that Jim Jones was the host of Branham's own healing campaigns Outside of the state of Indiana, it was almost overwhelming. How many of the 1956 and 1957 meetings were hosted by Jim Jones? How many of the blank spots on tape in William Branham's sermon transcripts was a result of Branham's collaboration with Jim Jones?